Dr. Grace Torra, and I'm the Dean of the Iona School here in the Diocese of Olympia, and welcome to this webinar. I'm more used to doing Zoom where I'm in meetings and I can see people, so this one feels a little different, and I'm adjusting, but we will figure this one out and it'll work. Little background on me. I have a Doctor of Ministry degree with a focus on spiritual formation, and I have been working in Iona programs both here in the Diocese of Olympia and in the Diocese of the Rio Grande for 6 years now. Wow, how time flies when you're having fun. So I also work as the Director of IT for the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology, and I'm an adjunct faculty there sometimes. So I get around, and I am very excited to spend this time tonight with you talking about spiritual disciplines. So let's do it. I'm aware that I don't really know much about you, so I've prepared this webinar at a level I think it's interesting. For some of you, it may be a little boring, and for some of you, it may be more than you ever wanted to know. And hopefully I'm somewhere in the middle there. The other thing to keep in mind here is that this is going to be the first in a series of webinars. And we're looking forward to hopefully doing about one a month for the coming months. And I've invited different folks from around the diocese to come and join me and talk about different topics around spiritual discipline that they find interesting. So in many ways, this is an introduction and preparation for the meat of the discussion, which will come in future months. So let's step into it. The first question, if you're going to talk about spiritual disciplines, you really need to talk about what is spirituality. What do we mean when we're talking about spirituality? The first place I often go to answer questions, which often doesn't give a very satisfying answer, is Google. And so according to Google, spirituality is the quality of being concerned with the human spirit or soul, as opposed to material or physical things. That's an interesting definition, and I think it's actually problematic in that I think if we have a very robust understanding of spirituality, it includes not only the human spirit and the soul, but our bodies. We don't want to lapse into a duality there. So let's keep looking for a better definition. John Macquarie says spirituality is seeking to become a person in the fullest sense. And I like that. I think that is getting closer. I think that one of the goals of spiritual disciplines is to help us live fully, to live lives where we're thriving. We're thriving spiritually, we're thriving emotionally, we're thriving physically. I don't think you can separate those apart. So spirituality is really this sense of being wholly human, thriving human. One of the definitions I like best, though, is this one from Mark Yaconelli. And he says, spirituality simply refers to how human beings, young or old, respond to their desire for relatedness to God. It is about how we channel this desire, the disciplines and habits we choose in our everyday lives to be in conscious or unconscious relationship to this holy longing. I like that. I think that gives a much broader and richer sense. Macquarie doesn't actually talk about God in his definition of spirituality, and I like having that desire for God, that longing for God, as part of our definition. So I think that's the definition I'm going to go with. Spirituality is our longing, conscious or unconscious, to be with God, and how we go about doing that. So I have a question for you, since I can't see you and I don't know who you are. I wanted to ask, what is your experience of God? And so we are going to do a poll here. What is your experience of God? I've had a profound experience of God's presence. I have some awareness of God's presence, off again, on again. not sure what's up with God, or God, what God? And all of those answers are great. I mean, we can work with all of them. So I would love to hear what your experience is. Okay, we have about 11 of 16 people have voted. Give it a couple more minutes. Okay, I'm going to end the poll, and I believe you will see the results at that point. So hopefully you can see it. About 67% of you have had a profound experience of God. 20% have some awareness of God's presence, and for 13% of you, it's on again, off again. And I've been in all of those categories. I've actually been in the categories you haven't chosen there. So, and that's great. God is present with us wherever we are. Okay, let us keep going here. So I wanted to talk first about some dimensions of spirituality, so that we have sort of broader grounding to look at what's happening here. Historically, spirituality has been defined using the following dimensions. So, and these tend to be continuum or dichotomy. So personal versus social, ascetic versus incarnational, affective versus cognitive, and apophatic versus cataphatic. And we're going to talk a little bit about each of those. But generally speaking, you can take spiritual disciplines and put them into those 4 dimensions and get a sense of what kind of spiritual discipline it is. So personal social. This is really talking about whether a person's spirituality is best experienced within a group context, or is it a spirituality that is better lived out in a private context? Historically within the church, we've tended in some ways to privilege the private, the monk living in the desert, although we certainly also have an understanding of the group context, of the corporate context in terms of worship, corporate worship. John Wesley is a good example of the personal approach, while Shane Claiborne demonstrates the social approach. And if you're familiar with Shane Claiborne, he's very socially active. Ascetic, incarnational. So the incarnational side of this dimension engages the body. And the ascetic side works more to deny the body. I'm not sure I like the word denying, but tends to be less body focused. Brother Lawrence's practice of the presence of God is a good example of the incarnational approach. Brother Lawrence talks about prayer while he's doing dishes in the monastery kitchen. And Teresa of Lisieux, The Story of a Soul, provides a good example of the ascetic approach. And both of them are fascinating reads and incredible stories, and both of them are valid ways of longing and seeking God. Ascetic versus incarnational, also, okay, I already mentioned that the church has been more comfortable with the ascetic than the incarnational. I think I did, maybe I didn't. So yeah, historically we've been much more focused on the denial rather than incarnational. But I got to say that isn't actually biblical. The affirmation of the goodness of the physical world, including our bodies, begins at creation in Genesis 1. God creates and says it is good. And then when God makes humankind, God says it is very good. And that goodness, that sense of the goodness of physical creation goes through the entire biblical narrative. And really reaches a climax in Revelation 21 as we return to the garden as the New Jerusalem descends down to earth. So I want to be careful not to associate spiritual just with the ascetic. I think that you can be incarnational and be very, very spiritual. And I think there's spiritual disciplines that are very incarnational. And I think that is healthy. I think we were made not to be disembodied souls, but to be embodied souls. We are flesh. And even in these times of COVID where we may not be bodies together, I think that incarnation is just as important, or perhaps even more important. Affective cognitive. So this dimension is really looking at whether there's more of an emphasis on emotions or on the intellect. When there's a focus on cognitive side, there tends to be a greater emphasis on correct beliefs, I can say that, or orthodoxy. And when the emphasis is on the affective side, there is a greater emphasis on the transformation of the will, the transformation of the heart, or orthocardia. Thomas Aquinas is probably the great example of the cognitive approach. Give him a read. And Catherine of Genoa would be an example of the affective. And again, both of these are important and both of these are valid. And I'd say as the body of Christ, we need both of them or all of them. Apophatic and cataphatic, and this is actually one of my favorite ones. So this dimension really explores how we discern the presence of God. And the apophatic approach attempts to discern the presence of God in the hidden. Apophatic says we can't really see God, so God is in the unknown. So an apophatic spirituality prefers prayers without words or content, and is often referred to as the via negativa, the negative way. The cataphatic approach uses words and images and concepts and attempts to see God in human activity. And this is known as the via positiva. The cloud of unknowing would be a good example of the apophatic approach, if you've ever read that, written anonymously. And Ignatius's spiritual exercises are an example of the cataphatic, very much using images and imagination to see and experience God. So the most important part to think about in terms of these dimensions is there's no right answer. They're all good. They're all important. We tend to focus and endorse those aspects with which we're most comfortable. So if you prefer to be alone, then you're probably going to be looking at the solitary spiritual disciplines more than the group disciplines. And that's interesting, and it can be good to build on our strengths, but it also, I think, is good to look at what it is we're avoiding and see if there's a way that can deepen our experience of God. The other thing to realize is that for much of our history, the monastic emphasis was on a personal, ascetic, cognitive, and cataphatic spirituality. And that was really seen as the ideal. And I think some of that still lingers in maybe perhaps unconsciously or sort of under the surface in how we view some spiritual disciplines. I think we tend to think that the ones that are personal and ascetic and cognitive and cataphatic are somehow better or more spiritual or closer to God. And I want to push back on that one a little as well. I think that all of those are good and they all have benefits, but I think that the other side of those dimensions is beneficial as well. So the classical spiritual process. So Pseudo-Dionysius was probably the first one who really described this and described 3 stages. The first one is purgation, second one is illumination, and third one is union. In some traditions, it's referred to as deification or theosis. So let's talk about each of those a little bit. First, note that these stages aren't completely distinct. You can be in the purgative stage and still have moments of union or deep contemplation of God. And a person who has experienced deification may at the same time continue to experience purification. So yeah, there is some linearity to it, but it's not absolutely linear or distinct. So purgation. Purgation is a process of letting go, particularly of those things that keep us from or interfere with our relationship with God. And purgation then results in purification. So if you think of fasting, we're letting go of our attachment to food. And I think, the reality is that a lot of us do use food as a way to distract ourselves from our own pain, from what's happening around us, or from encounters with God. So that kind of purification of letting go of attachments to food or attachments to social media, whatever we're attached to that is either distracting us from God or hiding God from our awareness. Active purification is intentional letting go, but there's also passive purification, and that's when God uses the circumstances of our lives to achieve purification. I got to tell you that passive purification can, that can be a doozy sometimes, but it can also be incredibly effective, I can say that, incredibly effective. And so one of the things we get to do is embrace those times where our life situations are encouraging a passive purification or purgation. And in some ways, again, quarantine is one of those times. Is God using the circumstance of our lives in quarantine to purify us, to help us let go of things that are distracting us from God or hindering our relationship from God? And it's a good question. Generally, the thought is that an individual who has moved through this stage is no longer ruled by their passions or emotions. Again, this isn't an absolute, you can't check purgation off and say, well, I'm done with it, I'll never come back to it, because you're still going to be facing purification even as you're in the other stages. I think it's interesting to note that in the Greek, purification is the word catharsis, and it is from this word that we get the English word catharsis. So if you think of purification as a catharsis, there's something for me that is liberating in that thought. Purification is a catharsis. It's a letting go and a change. Illumination, sometimes also referred to as theoria or contemplation, is characterized by an increasing contemplation or awareness of God. So you let go of your attachments, your distractions, and when you let go of those, you are more able to see and be present to God. Again, the purifications of purgation may continue, but they're increasingly overtaken by this contemplation of the presence of God. A number of years ago, I had the opportunity to go as a parent with one of my kids on a school field trip. And they needed 4 parents to go sit on platforms up about, 30 or 40 feet on a high ropes course. And so the parents had to get there early and do the course. I love high ropes courses, but it was a little scary. Basically going across from telephone pole to telephone pole. And the last one, you're hooked onto the telephone pole. You hook yourself onto a line, and then you step down off of the platform onto a cable that runs to the very last pole. And above it is a rope that you hold on to. And so you hold on to this rope, and you have to then reach for the next rope. But the problem is you can't actually reach the next rope and still hold on to the pole. You have to let go of the pole. And I remember standing there looking at it and wondering, what was I going to do? And the guide who was on the ground, who had me on belay, looked at me and said, sometimes you have to let go of what you're holding on to get where you want to go. And it was a profound God moment for me. So when we all got through the course and the kids arrived and they're asking, asking parents to choose which one they want to be on, I chose that one. And so I sat on this pole for basically a whole day, and I got to talk to public school students about how they sometimes had to let go of what they were holding on to get where they wanted to go. And it was a profoundly theological, God-filled moment, even if the kids didn't recognize it. So it was great. I will say that when we'd have breaks and we learned not to get off the pole, because then you had to go through the whole course again. And so I would sit up there. I was in seminary at the time studying Greek, and I'd sit up there with my Greek flashcards. And I actually decided I was Saint Stephen the Stylite, sitting on my 30-foot high pole. So that it was a great experience. Union, and again, this is sometimes referred to as deification or theosis, is that stage when a person's mind remains largely focused on God. And I got to tell you, at this point, I'm probably talking about things that I have some glimmer of, but have not mastered. This should be understood metaphorically rather than literally. So when talking about deification or theosis or union, we do not become God. We are not the same as God, but we become united with God while still maintaining our separateness. So it's it can be understood more as a communion with God, a union of love, a surrounding of God's presence where we're enveloped with God. And I would say that mysticism in particular is describing this kind of union. At least that's my sense of it. Some circles of the Christian church have struggled with the idea of union, or as the Greeks would call it, deification. But I think that there is scriptural support for it. So this is from 2 Peter. His divine power has given us everything we need for a godly life through our knowledge of him who has called us by his own glory and goodness. Through these, he has given us his very great and precious promises, so that through them you may participate in the divine nature, having escaped the corruption in the world caused by evil desires. So you've gone through purgation, you move into illumination, and then you reach a point where you are participating in the divine nature. I love that description, participating in the divine nature. So let's talk about some spiritual disciplines. First of all, the word discipline has a lot of baggage in the English language, and a fairly negative connotation at that. But I think it's important to realize that the word discipline comes from the same root as the word disciple. So spiritual discipline is a spiritual discipling, a spiritual following of Jesus, if you will. Historically, there have been ways of understanding spiritual disciplines. A lot of books within the recent decades talking about spiritual disciplines talk about it as training or practice. It's talked about they can be talked about as a means of purification, and then or as methods for forming and or transforming Christians. I have some concerns about using the words training or practice. And my reasons are that I used to be a musician. I played bassoon, and when I practiced, I wasn't actually performing. I wasn't in the orchestra. I wasn't doing what I did. And when I train, I'm not actually doing a triathlon or whatever I might be training for. I'm training for it. And so I think that tends to move spiritual disciplines into something we do in preparation for encountering God. And I think that's dangerous. I think that actually spiritual disciplines are a way of encountering God. Some of the ones, particularly the purification ones, may not have as much of that encounter of God. So in that way, they may be a preparation. But even those, I think that people have profound experiences of the presence of God in the midst of them. So I have some concerns with the use of practice or training. Eugene Peterson writes, the assumption of spirituality is that always God is doing something before I know it. So the task is not to get God to do something I think needs to be done, but to become aware of what God is doing so that I can respond in it and participate and take delight in it. And I think that applies to spiritual disciplines as well, that they provide an avenue for me to respond to God and participate in what God is doing and take delight in it. I may be a little weird, but I love it when I am reading and studying scripture and I discover something new there, something I hadn't seen before. And there is a sense of delight and joy in God's presence when I have those kinds of experiences. So I think that brings God God joy as well. I think God is thrilled when we respond and when we participate and when we take delight in that presence, in that relationship. So different people list different spiritual disciplines. And it is really easy for academicians in particular to get wound around the axle on what is and what isn't a spiritual discipline. You will find some that say the only real spiritual disciplines are the ones that you can find attested in Scripture. I'm not going to go there. I believe that any spiritual practice, don't like using that word again, spiritual discipline that is leading you into God's presence and giving you a fuller awareness of God is great. And let's not get hung up on the definitions there. So this is Dallas Willard. He breaks spiritual disciplines into two families: disciplines of abstinence, or the purification. So under abstinence, Dallas lists solitude, silence, fasting, frugality, chastity, secrecy, sacrifice. And then disciplines of engagement, so study, worship, celebration, service, prayer, fellowship, confession, and submission. That is a useful way of looking at spiritual disciplines and a great list of possible disciplines, but it's certainly not the only way of looking at disciplines. So this is Richard Foster's way. Richard Foster groups them in three groups: inward disciplines, so meditation, prayer, fasting, and study; outward disciplines, simplicity, solitude, submission, service; and corporate disciplines of confession, worship, guidance, and celebration. And you may notice that Richard has disciplines that Dallas didn't, and vice versa. And that's pretty much how it happens. And then there are a boatload of disciplines that I think neither of them mentioned that I think are actually quite important. So contemplation, doing the daily office, that's a spiritual discipline. The examen, hospitality, journaling, labyrinths, lectio divina, retreat, Sabbath, spiritual direction. All of these are disciplines. I didn't even put on there things like doing prayer walks. I used to live in New Mexico, and for me, walking in the desert was a God time. That is where most often I heard God speaking. So I got to tell you, the Pacific Northwest has been a little bit of a challenge, but I'm getting there. So any kind of discipline that you can do strategically, regularly, that helps you experience God's presence, that's a discipline. So let's do another poll here. And let me say that one of the challenges here is that Zoom only allows us to have 10 options here. On this poll, I originally had 23, and Zoom was not happy. So I have picked my favorite 10 for the poll. And I'm going to put it up, and you can choose as many as you want. So the question is, which of these spiritual disciplines have you experienced? And again, choose as many as you want. How many of these have you experienced? Okay, about 2/3 of you have finished. I'll give you a few more minutes to finish responding. About 10 more seconds. Okay, I'm going to end the poll. Let me share the results. So let me say that this is a very different outcome than I get when I do it with my graduate students. So first of all, it tells me very interesting group out there. I'm really excited. I wish I could see you and talk with you. So about half of you have done confession. 93% have done contemplation meditation. Wow. 33% have done the examen. 60% have done fasting. 73% have practiced hospitality. 80% have done journaling, my goodness. 80% have done labyrinths. 87% have practiced prayer. 73% Sabbath, and 60% simplicity. Fascinating. Thank you for sharing that. Oh, excellent. So I want to pivot a little bit. What I've been describing so far has sort of been the classical understanding of spiritual disciplines. And several years ago, I was reading Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's theory of flow. And I had an aha moment, which I take as always a Holy Spirit moment, and really started wondering whether there was an aspect of flow in spiritual disciplines. So Mihaly, I'm going to call him by his first name because it's too hard to say his last name. Mihaly was doing research on particularly peak performances, and he looked at athletes and artists, and really was looking at what was happening in peak experiences. So when an athlete is running a race and is in the zone, what was going on, or when an artist was doing art and engulfed by their art, what was going on. And so he came up with these. It ended up being 8 different aspects of flow. Really felt that they were related to human thriving. So that when we're in this, when we have a flow experience, we're often in a moment of thriving, of truly living. So, and I see that there's a lot going on in the chat, and I will look at that in a little while. I can't, yeah. So I'll come back to chat in a little bit. So here are the aspects of flow that Mihaly identified. Generally, a person would experience flow if the task was challenging but attainable. So not so hard that they couldn't do it, but not so easy that they're like, whatever, doing the dishes. Okay, I wash another dish, put it over here. Although, Brother Lawrence would argue against that. There is a merging of action and awareness where that there's, you're doing and you know what to do next. Your body is so engrossed in the task that you know the exact next movement you need to do. Clear goals, so there's a way of measuring that you know what it is you need to do. Immediate feedback on whether you're doing it well or not. There's an intense concentration and focus. So you are so focused on the task that you are unaware of what's going on around you. There's a sense of personal agency, so you have a sense that you can do this. And there's a loss of self-consciousness. You stop thinking about yourself. You stop thinking about whether you're hungry or tired or, that hard conversation you had at work in the morning. You're just so engrossed in the task that you are not the focus of your thought. And there's a transformation of time that there either time becomes dilated or compressed. So either, when you finish, when you get to the end of whatever flow activity you're in, you look back on it and go, oh, that took 5 hours. It felt like, half an hour. Or you say, oh, that's only been 15 minutes. It felt like I was doing that. I was so engrossed. I felt like I got 2 hours worth of creativity packed into those 15 minutes or whatever it was. And I find it interesting because I think that a lot of these attributes, maybe not all of them, you find in spiritual disciplines, particularly when you have that sense of the presence of God. So I want you to think about a time you experienced a flow state. You could have been running or painting or celebrating with friends. What happened? How did it feel? And did you just experience all the facets of flow described by Csikszentmihalyi? So I'm going to go back to those 8, and I'm going to give you a couple of minutes just to think of a flow experience you've had. And it could have been physical, it could have been sports, it could have been creative, it could have been arts, it could have been in a group, in company, just, when you're with friends and you are all just so in sync and it's just an incredible time. It could have been holding a baby or snuggling with your spouse, any number of those. I mean, I think the list is limitless. So let's go back, and I'm going to give you just a couple of minutes here to think about a time you've experienced flow. Okay. Hopefully you've had a moment of flow in your life, at least one. And hopefully that recollection, that revision, if it were provided you with a moment of peace and joy and thriving. So I would like to propose that spiritual disciplines are a means of entering into God's flow. And I'm not aware of anyone else who's done this. So you're hearing, this is definitely Grace Torra theory. It has not been scientifically validated or even written in a journal yet. So you're getting cutting edge stuff here. I am trying to work on a journal article, but gosh, that's hard. So spiritual disciplines become a means to move into that flow moment in God's presence. And so rather than seeing spiritual disciplines as practice for a future encounter with God, or just as a means of purification in order to approach God, I believe that spiritual disciplines allow us to experience God's presence and enter into a flow state with and within God. So, particularly if you look at many of the descriptions of mystical encounters with Christ or with the Holy Spirit or even with God the Father, they often include some of the attributes of Csikszentmihalyi's flow. If you read a lot of the mystics, a lot of them describe dilations of time. A lot of them, probably almost all of them, describe a loss of self-consciousness, a loss of self-awareness, maybe. I'm not sure I'd put it quite that way. A merging of action and awareness and an intense concentration of focus. And so I'd like to propose that perhaps union with God or deification may be better understood and certainly less controversial to be the process of entering into God's flow. When we experience with union with God, what is happening is we have entered into God's flow. We are our time becomes God's time. Our consciousness becomes God's consciousness. Our focus and concentration are on God. It's interesting. I suspect, although I have no proof of this, that some disciplines are better for entering into God's flow than others. Although when I had this discussion with graduate students and commented that for me, journaling is not a flow experience, I was surprised to have two different graduate students say, oh, it is so much a flow experience for them. And they described these moments of journaling and just experiencing God's presence and love around them. And I'm going, wow, okay. So I am hesitant to say that any spiritual discipline will not help you enter into God's flow, because obviously my experience is not entire. So your mileage may vary. So I want to ask you, and it would be grand if we could actually have this conversation, but maybe some other time, have you ever experienced a sense of God's flow, particularly in the midst of doing a spiritual discipline? So ponder that for a moment. Have you ever experienced God's flow? Okay, that is most of what I had to present to you this evening. I am aware that for some of you, I may have gone too deep, and for others of you, I did not go deep enough. So whichever one it was, I apologize. Let's see. Let me look at chat. Yes, I can make the slides. I can do a PDF, and I assume we have everyone's email, so there must be a way to send it out. Okay. April already answered that. Thank you, April. Okay, thank you. Great. Okay, I have one more poll for you. And I'd love to, for those of you who have great stories of being in flow, I would love to hear about them. You can find my email address on the diocesan website. So if you have a way to do it. Okay, Bill raised his hand, and I do not even know how to handle that, Bill. April, do you have, what do we do with hand raising?
Yeah, sure. So I see Eileen has a hand raised, and I've allowed Eileen to talk. And
okay.
My hands. I'll keep my eyes on any others.
And Bill raised his hand for a moment as well.
Oh, okay. All right. I think Bill and Eileen are both able to talk.
Okay, Eileen, why don't you go ahead?
Oh, I actually didn't have my hand raised. I was just writing you a chat.
Oh, okay.
I will write you the story, but I can give it in 30-second version.
Okay.
I was a nun meditating on our retreat Sunday. I was so into flow that when I awakened from flow, our cow Mabel had chewed my veil from my knee to my shoulder, and I pulled 9 yards of surge out of her mouth. 9, probably 3 yards of surge out of her mouth. So
I love it.
that was my experience of flow.
Yeah, that does sound like flow to me. Okay. Bill.
Okay, I didn't really have my hand raised. It was a mistake. I hit the button by mistake. Sorry.
No worries.
However, I can talk about an experience that I had that I think I would describe as flow. And it had to do with the birth of my first child, my son. And I was in the delivery room. And after he was born and they had cleaned him up, the nurse came and handed him to me. And it was an overwhelming experience. I looked to his face and I had this awareness, this physical and spiritual awareness that I was not the source of this child's life, that I was merely an instrument, and that God was the source of this child's life. And it was an amazing experience, probably the deepest God moment in my life.
I love it. That's beautiful. So, and since Bill is here for the moment, next month we will, Bill will be joining me and talking about mysticism. So I strongly encourage you to come back next month and we will discuss mysticism. I'm looking forward to it. Okay, let's see. So I had one more poll I wanted to do. And this poll is actually just looking at, given the same more or less 10 topics that I'm limited to since Zoom won't let me do 23. What would you be interested in hearing more about since we're going to try and do these monthly? So, and again, you can choose as many as you want. And we're certainly not limited to this list, obviously, since I originally had a list of 23. So if there is something else that you'd be interested in, go ahead and pop that up in the chat. But yeah, just if there are topics that people are interested in, I would love to know about it so that I can speak to those. Okay, I'll give you about 10 more seconds. I have a horrible sense of time. Actually, before I close this, one of the questions was, what is examine? And then some of the other, examine is an examination of conscience. And so it's a practice you can do particularly every evening, just reviewing your day. Well, some people do it several times a day, but reviewing your day or the last period and asking God to speak into it, really. Where were you not hearing God? Where were you hearing God? What do you need to pay attention to? So I don't think examine is used as much, but I think it's very powerful. So, okay, evangelism. And yes, there are examine apps. There are several out there. Some of them have, they ask different questions every night, so that can be nice. Sometimes it's nice to have the same questions all the time. Pitfalls of spiritual excesses and disciplines. That's a good one too. Okay, I'm going to end the poll and share the results. Fascinating results. So you guys are interested in hospitality and simplicity. Those are wonderful topics. And certainly ones that I think are very apropos for our time. I have to admit, I'm a little sad that journaling was not one people were excited about. I actually am, I like creative journaling, so I have a slightly different take on journaling. Okay, great. Well, this gives me some guidance for the future, and I really appreciate that. That helps a lot. Okay, that is all I have, but I am welcome to, if you have any questions that you would like to ask me. Any other things you would like to say? So I'm going to get this list while I can. Okay. Anything else? Well, I'm going to stop screen sharing. I would like to say thank you to everyone who came and joined us. I appreciate you being here. I hope this was useful. April, do we do some kind of survey afterwards to get feedback?
We certainly can, absolutely.
Okay, I think that might be useful. Keep an eye on the diocesan website for the August webinar, which will be on mysticism with Father Bill. And I look forward to seeing you next month. Have a wonderful evening.